We are going to start today with the components of blood. The average person has about 5 liters of blood, that is 5 liters of blood, and it's important for a number of reasons. We've already talked, when we talked about circulation, about how blood is very important for transport. It's also important for fluid balance, osmoregulation. We've talked about that quite a bit this semester. We haven't talked about how the blood is useful for defense yet, but we're going to get to that today. Now, all blood is made of cells in liquid circulating through some kind of vessel. And we can see in this picture here, the pale background, that's the liquid, and then these circles, those are the cells. There are other cells in here, but they're harder to see because they are not red. We're going to start by looking at the liquid components of the blood, and then we'll change gears and we'll talk about the cellular components. So the liquid of blood is called plasma, and that makes up 55% of the volume of the blood. The other 45% is cellular, mostly red blood cells. Plasma, when you remove all of the cells, is this pale yellowish liquid, and it has a lot of the components of blood that are really important functionally for what blood does. 90% of plasma is going to be water, and then it's going to contain a lot of salts, dissolved ions. So we've talked a lot about things like sodium and potassium and calcium. All of those things are circulating in your blood in very highly regulated concentrations. Blood is very tightly regulated in terms of its pH as well. It's buffered to about 7.4, and these salts and the pH help regulate the osmotic balance of your body as a whole, because it's this fluid that is getting filtered during the filtration step in your kidneys. It's also going to dictate the composition of the interstitial fluid, due to the exchange mechanism that we talked about last time that occurs in capillary beds. So the contents of the blood has to be very tightly regulated because it has so much to do with the osmotic balance of the rest of the body. One major thing that we find in plasma are the proteins that are circulating in the bloodstream, and they have a number of really important functions as well. One thing they do that we've already talked about is regulate the fluid in the plasma versus the interstitial fluid, because they are going to exert a very strong effect on the osmotic balance between the capillary beds and the surrounding interstitial fluid. Those proteins also function as buffers, so they're going to help regulate the pH. And in particular, there's a group of proteins called albumins that specifically function to maintain the balance of the pH and regulate the osmotic balance of the blood more generally. So linking all this back to homeostasis, the idea is that the blood, the contents and characteristics of the blood, is going to affect a lot of other variables in the body in terms of things like ions and pH. So we need to very tightly regulate the blood, and that has knock-on effects down the rest of the body. If the blood is in the correct range, then the rest of the body will be closer to that range and easier to regulate. If the blood is out of whack, then that's going to throw off a bunch of things kind of downstream of that. So it's very important to regulate things like pH and osmotic balance, and it's plasma proteins, specifically albumins, that do a lot of that work. There are also proteins called immunoglobulins circulating in the bloodstream. These are antibodies. You've probably heard that word, and you know that they are for defense. We're not going to talk about antibodies more today, but we are going to spend a lot of time talking about antibodies next time when we talked about the adaptive immune response. There's also a group of proteins we've already talked about but haven't specifically named, called apolipoproteins. These are useful for lipid transport. So remember when we talked about water-soluble versus lipid-soluble hormone pathways? Well, the apolipoproteins are those transport proteins that move lipid-soluble hormones through your bloodstream. They're not just moving hormones, but that's one of the major things they can use. So you need these water-soluble transport proteins that grab onto hydrophobic materials in the bloodstream to allow them to circulate smoothly without clumping up. And then finally, there are proteins called fibrinogens, which we are going to talk about a little bit later today in the context of blood clotting. So we're not going to talk more about these right now, but we will see their function in the context of clotting. Now, one more word for you related to plasma is serum. Blood serum is just the plasma with the fibrinogens removed. So that is a kind of separate thing. It's derived from plasma. It's plasma without one of the major components, the fibrinogens. There's also a lot of stuff that gets transported through the blood that we find dissolved in the blood in some way. So one thing is nutrients. Obviously, you have things like glucose and other sugars that are going to be transported in your bloodstream. We've talked a lot this semester about like blood glucose levels, for example. We also have waste products, which are the result of breaking down those sugars. So we have to get CO2 out of the body. There are gases that we need, like oxygen, that are going to circulate in the blood, and we'll talk about how that works in a few minutes when we talk about red blood cells. And of course, something else we've talked about a lot this semester, there are hormones circulating in the blood. So all of these different types of substances are things that are transported through the bloodstream. And this is something we kind of touched on last time with circulation. Circulation, or the circulatory system, is the thing that links all the other systems in the body together. And in order to do that, you need to transport materials back and forth between them. So here are some of the major groups of things that gets transported in the bloodstream. In addition to the plasma and its components and the stuff that gets transported, there are a ton of cellular components to the blood. Now, these are produced in the bone marrow predominantly, mostly in larger bones in the body. So, for example, the sternum, the ribs, vertebrae, the pelvis. We're also learning that apparently blood cells are produced in organs like the lungs as well, although research on that is kind of still going on, so we're not entirely sure what's going on. But it looks like that blood cells are produced in places other than bone marrow. But for the most part, we think about it as bone marrow being the main site of production for the cells of blood. In the bone marrow, we find cells called multipotent stem cells. These are stem cells that can divide into a number of different things. They're not totipotent, they can't become anything, but they can become one of many different types of blood cells as they divide and specialize. So you have these stem cells, and when they divide, one will stay the same, and the other one can either stay the same to propagate the stem cells, or it can specialize and become some different type of blood cell. You don't need to know this sequence. We're not going to ask you to correctly sequence the development pathway for specific types of blood cells, but I just want to show you basically how the different types of blood cells are related. So you have your stem cells, and they can split into two different types of stem cells, which can then further specialize into the types of blood cells. So we have our red blood cells or platelets, and then all the rest of these other cells in here, these are grouped together under the heading of white blood cells. And we're going to talk about them a little bit in just a few minutes, and then we'll talk a lot more about them, particularly the B and T cells, next time when we talk about the adaptive immune response. So we group our blood cells into three main categories. We have red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Structurally and functionally, they're all doing different things, and they all look very different from each other. We're going to start with red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes. So remember, cyte means cell, and erythro, anyone remember what that means? Should be obvious. It is red, right? Like phycoerythrin is the pigment for red algae. So erythrocyte means red cell, and these are the red blood cells. These are the most numerous blood cells by far. The average adult has approximately 25 trillion, that's trillion with a T, red blood cells in your body. That works out to about 5 to 6 million cells per microliter of blood. That is microliter of blood. Your red blood cells last about 120 days before they wear out and are replaced. Before we continue, allow me to apologize because you may have heard a garbage truck at the tail end of that last slide, and now you may hear my dog barking at the garbage truck. So hopefully there will be minimal background noise from here going forward, but I can't promise it. So now let's talk about the characteristics of erythrocytes, or red blood cells. Red blood cells are flexible biconcave discs. Okay, so they're discs, so they're flat and round. They're biconcave, meaning that each side is thinner in the middle than it is on the edge. So it's got like a donut, and then it becomes flat in the middle. Very importantly, they are flexible for a reason we talked about last time when we looked at capillaries. The diameter of capillaries in some parts of your body is actually smaller than the diameter of red blood cells. So red blood cells have to kind of deform and squeeze through the narrow passages. So they have to be flexible in order to work. As mature red blood cells, they do not have nuclei. The idea is that we're going to pack the red blood cells full of a protein called hemoglobin that we'll see in just a second. that is responsible for carrying oxygen. You want to maximize the space in that cytoplasm for hemoglobin, so you make all the hemoglobin you can, pack it all in there to the point where you actually get rid of the nucleus so that you're not making any more over the course of the lifetime of the cell. You're just transporting as much stuff as possible. Along the same lines, they also don't have mitochondria. They are doing purely anaerobic metabolism. Once they've made all their hemoglobin and they get rid of their nuclei, they're not doing gene expression anymore because there's no nucleus. That's a major energetic demand that has now been removed, so we don't need to be able to do the full aerobic respiration pathway that we talked about way back in GB 115. We can get by just doing anaerobic metabolism to get just enough ATP to keep everything working. The big idea with erythrocytes is that they are specialized for oxygen transport. And this is really important because oxygen is insoluble in aqueous solutions. Oxygen does not readily dissolve in water. And to explain why, think about the O2 molecule. So you have one oxygen atom, a double covalent bond, and another oxygen atom. Now those two atoms have equal electronegativity. So that bond is not polar in any way. There are no partial charges on that molecule. Or I should say there are no persistent partial charges on that molecule. That means that O2 does not readily form hydrogen bonds with water molecules, so you need some other means of efficiently transporting it through the bloodstream. The solution to this problem is a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the oxygen transport protein we find in red blood cells. Hemoglobin is made of 4 subunits, 2 alpha, 2 beta, so we've got 1, 2, 1, 2, I forget which is which, it does not matter. The important thing is that each of these subunits has this region called a heme group, and that's where the name comes from, hemoglobin. Each of those heme groups contains a single iron atom, and it's that iron atom that bonds with the oxygen. And it bonds in a temporary way. It's not truly forming a chemical bond, they just have an affinity for each other. So the oxygen fits very well into that part of the molecule, but it doesn't get stuck in there. So depending on the ambient environment, you can either pack the hemoglobin full of oxygen, or it can very readily release the oxygen into the surrounding environment. And just to link this back to something we talked about a little while ago, this is why iron is an important micronutrient in your body. You need iron for your hemoglobin, which means an iron deficiency can lead to problems with oxygen transport in your blood. The second type of blood cell is white blood cells, or leukocytes, white blood cells. This is the album White Blood Cells by the White Stripes. See what I did there? It's a pop culture reference, but I'm old, so you probably didn't get it, but that's okay. So here in our cells, this one right here is the white blood cell. White blood cells are specialized for defense against pathogens. That is what they do. One interesting note about white blood cells is they are not confined to the circulatory system or the blood vessels. They'll use the blood vessels to get around the body very quickly, but then they can actually leave and move into the interstitial fluid or the lymph nodes. We're not going to talk about white blood cells anymore right now, but we are going to talk about them more a little bit later on today when we get to the innate immune system, and then we'll talk a lot about them next time when we talk about adaptive immunity. The final cellular component to blood is platelets. These little things right here are platelets. Platelets are not whole cells. They are derived from whole cells, these big cells in the bone marrow. And basically, you get these big cells, they pinch off little bits, and those little bits are called platelets. Platelets do not have nuclei, and they are involved in clotting. So we're going to talk more about platelets in a few minutes when we get to blood clotting and see how that works. This is figure 42.16, and it's a really nice summary of the contents of blood. So on the left here, we have the plasma, which, as I said, makes up 55% of the blood volume. And we have a number of components here. Not all of these are things that we specifically talked about, but most things in here we mentioned. And then over here on the right, we have the 45% that's made up of cells. So we have the various types of white blood cells, platelets, and red blood cells. I'm never going to ask you like the specific numbers here. And you also don't need to know most of the different types of white blood cells. Between today and next time, I'm going to mention a few specific types of white blood cells. You won't need to know the rest. So don't worry about like eosinophils versus basophils. You're never going to need to know that in Gen Bio. Definitely know the functions associated with each cell type, however. Okay, so that's the contents of blood. The next thing we're going to do is talk about clotting, and then we'll change gears and we'll get to the immune system.